Hello, this is Amy Hayes speaking, and welcome to the State of Michigan's ADA 30th Anniversary Series. And today we are presenting best practices for hosting accessible virtual presentations. And this will be put on by the Michigan Department of Labor and Economic Opportunity, Department of Natural Resources, and Michigan Department of Civil Rights. The presenters today include myself, Amy Hayes. I'm an occupational therapist and consultant for Michigan Rehabilitation Services, MRS, in the Michigan Department of Labor and Economic Opportunity. And now I'll let the group introduce themselves. Elena?
Hello, my name is Elena Lale. This is my sign name because I've got curly hair. I'm a civil rights representative for the Division on Deaf, Deafblind, and Hard of Hearing. Hello. Hello, my name is Annie, and my sign name is Annie, A on the cheek here. And I am the Division Director for the Division on Deaf, Deafblind, and Hard of Hearing in the Michigan Department of Civil Rights.
Hello, this is Diana Pies. That's P-A-I-Z. I'm a web admin with the Michigan History Center in the Michigan Department of Natural Resources.
Hi, this is Kelly Frake. I'm a compliance analyst for the State ADA Compliance Division in the Michigan Department of Civil Rights.
Hello. So the objectives of this training is to make sure that you understand how to make everything accessible for our community. We will explain, the decisions you make prior to a presentation so that you can make it a successful meeting or webinar. Virtual meeting platforms there's different considerations. There's pros and cons, but it's important to really think about best practices for inclusion and in regards to different materials and content. Next slide, please. So pre-production decisions that you have to make, you have to consider things prior to planning a meeting. Because you don't want to have a lot of time taken up during the meeting, it's important that you think about things prior to the meeting in order to have effective communication and to have an accessible meeting. Next slide, please. When you think about the different considerations, the first thing you have to think about is this going to be a pre-recording or a live event? So pre-recording does have some positives and some negatives. A pre-recorded meeting, if you make a mistake or anything like that, you can start over because it's pre-recorded. You can do it as many times as you need to for the presentation. And you can do editing, post-production, you can add captioning, you can add images, a multitude of things. And with a live presentation, you do have interaction with the attendees. You can have Q&A, and you definitely have a more emotional connection with your audience. But, you do have, you're going to have mistakes in that. And so you'll have to, really deal with those in the moment as opposed to having a pre-production or a pre-recorded event. When you have live events, it's important that you think about registration and having people register because they need to have a Zoom account, and some people have a capacity for their account. Maybe they can have 300 attendees, 500, 1,000. So that's really something you need to consider and keep in the back of your mind when you're planning a virtual event. And you need to think about making sure that the audio and visual is accessible for the attendees. You're also going to think about, are you going to share videos? Are you going to share screens? Are you going to have PowerPoints in your presentation? Anything like that, it's going to depend on the content, of course. Accessibility is such an important part of making your presentation accessible because you want to make sure that everyone is included in the conversation. Perhaps maybe you need to provide an ASL interpreter or a captioner, a CART provider to provide captioning and live captioning. So you need to think about that. Who is the point of contact for the person who is going to receive accommodations for people who will be attending the meeting? There definitely needs to be someone for that. Next slide, please. Another thing to consider while you're running a Zoom meeting or a webinar or a virtual event, a workshop, it's important to think about monitoring the chat box, because maybe some people might want to share their screen or something like that, and you want to make sure that you have full control of the attendees. You know, and maybe they want to say that someone who's monitoring that and will say, oh, there's a person who has a question, and they will allow that person's screen to be shown in the webinar or the meeting, because you don't want anything to disrupt that. You want to have a smooth flow of communication. You need to think about who's going to be monitoring the interpreter switches. Typically, the interpreter themselves will switch at the appropriate time, but sometimes when we need to really make sure that that interpreter is spotlighted for attendees, perhaps that needs to be something that's controlled or moderated by someone who is part of the actual webinar presentation. Also, when you think about the CART providers, like right now we have live captioning, a live CART provider. So if you have pre-recording, you can add that captioning later if that's possible. And you need to think about who's going to control the layout of the Zoom. You know, perhaps the presenter might have a PowerPoint, and then you want the presenter in screen, and then you also have interpreters that you have to think about being in the screen. So you could have a side-by-side layout, or there's lots of different options, but you just want to make sure it's a smooth, successful setup. And everything you can set up on your laptop, you can record, you can, if you see side conversations and all that, that could be recorded as well. So be very attentive to that. When you're sharing any documents or any videos or content, make sure that you have to be aware and make sure that those documents are accessible to everyone attending the meeting. Next slide, please. Okay. So make sure any meeting notifications, any advertisement, any invites, they must have specific language for accommodation requests. So suppose it says, it'll say, if you need accommodations, please contact this person, and then you'll have the point of contact with their contact information, email, phone. It is important to always ask the person what they need when they make an accommodation request. Do not assume what they need. You definitely make sure that they are included in the process. And any content, any documents, videos, media, anything must be sent out, and make sure that it is the appropriate accommodations are provided. And it's important that people know the specific terminology and vocab required for those different presentations. It's important that the accommodation request be made 48 hours prior to the event so that people have time to review and get that set up and clarified. Any materials, anything that you're going to share on the platform, make sure that they are screen reader accessible. Not everything is. It depends on the platform, and it depends on the person who's making the request. So when you get a specific request, ask for that. Next slide, please.
Hi there, this is Annie speaking. Now let's talk a little bit more about what you think for choosing the different virtual meeting platforms that you could potentially use. These are important things to consider. You have to use technology to remove barriers to access instead of creating barriers to access. Right now, having the virtual world that we're living in, it's much improved for the types of technology that we have. And it's an important critical access need to make sure you're considering what accessibility you need to have already baked into your virtual meetings. Next slide, please. You can consider some of the following aspects here while you're trying to make a decision of what kind of virtual platform you're looking for that will be the best fit for your needs. There are any number of things to consider, one of the first being accommodation service providers. Some of the things you can consider would be sign language interpreters or CART providers. You have to see how they would be included within your platform. You also have to include would it have assistive technology resources available that would be navigable for screen reader users as well. You also want to consider if it's going to be user-friendly. Some of the most popular platforms, some people are going to be more familiar with, and then might be more user-friendly than having more niche platforms that people aren't as aware of and will not therefore be as user-friendly. It's important to consider your audience in that regard. You also have to consider your capacity, as was mentioned before. It depends how many participants you could potentially have or have included within your account. Could be 300 people or 500 people. What about the accessibility service providers and behind-the-scenes staff that are providing accessibility for the meeting? You also have to consider registration, if people are signing up using their email address or if they're able to sign up in other formats. Each individual can join the virtual platform, potentially using video. That means they could also use phone accommodations as well for people who want to join the meeting through audio only and not through video. These are all worth consideration. I want to add that you also need to be considering how often you'll be using that platform, whether it's happening just once, it's a one-time recording, or if you're recording a series of webinars, if you're having live sessions, and what kind of interaction you're looking for your audience as well. It could be a training, it could be a presentation, or it could be something where you have live interaction or a lively debate or discussion. You also need to consider the possibility that if you need to do a lot of preparation work behind the scenes for recording, there's going to be quite a bit that could be engaged with that. You have to develop things that are specific for the platform and the audience as well, whether you're doing something that's pre-recorded or if you're doing something that's live. If you wouldn't mind the next slide. Now let's talk a little bit more about the platform itself and how to prepare the platform for the things that you want to have appropriate to what kind of service you're providing. So the platform settings, it's something to consider whether or not people can use their phone for just audio or computer options, because remember, not everyone will have access to the platform in the same way. So you want to make sure that you're providing flexibility and accessibility. It could be that some people are joining from their browsers, from their cell phones, from their landline, from an app, from their smartphones. There are any number of ways that people could potentially access your platforms. So you want to be able to provide the appropriate accessibility that all of them are open and available for all of those types of users. You can also assign specific roles to help manage the meeting itself. For example, you could have a moderator, host, co-host, panelist, attendees, and it really depends on what you're looking for the event. So it's important to set those and keep those in mind before the event itself gets started. In terms of accessibility, if you're hosting a virtual event and you're including audio, it's important to make sure that you're providing some kind of captioning services for people who may be joining that need to use captioning services. That provides 100% accessibility for the audio content to make sure that that's translated and currently available visually for people to be able to read the English there as well. There is one caution that I do want to emphasize here, one word of warning. If you're using the audio connection, it's possible that the host or co-host can use mute for the participants. So it's important to know that you have that capability. Perhaps if you're joining using audio only, or perhaps you're using a screen reader to connect, there are some people who struggle with that, to be able to mute for this particular setting, to be able to mute themselves. So that can create a barrier for people who may not be able to mute or unmute themselves. Of course, you do want to make sure that you're testing everything before you start the actual event. In this way, one of the things you consider is to make sure that all of the settings that you want are already in place as far as audio, video, accommodation providers, and so forth, to make sure that's all worked out well and is smooth and ready to go by the time the event itself starts. Because you want to make sure that your event is fully visibly accessible for the people who can see. And then you also have to think about the layout and the design for the setup that you have for your event, so you can test that beforehand, before you go live, as it were. Next slide, please. Now, during your actual session, sometimes you will be interacting with the audience itself. You could use that through the chat feature. The settings here are important to consider the content of your event and the context of it as well. You have to consider how you would use the chat time during your presentation, meeting, or event. You can create full accessibility, because when the chat is on all of the time, it can be very distracting for the event and for the provider and the presenter of the event. So it's important to have a moderator stress from the very beginning of when the chat will be open and when it will be closed during specific times during the event. For those who are using screen readers, when the chat is on, the screen reader will actually be reading the chat in real time at the same time the presenter is speaking. So I do recommend, as best practices, to explain to your attendees beforehand, or your audience beforehand, when the chat will be open for public comment. And then go ahead and close it when you don't need to have that public comment accessible in that moment anymore. Another thing to consider is who your audience is and who they'll be communicating with. If you're having open interaction with everyone, or if they can only interact with the host, you can control those settings depending on your platform. Next slide, please. Right now, we're actually talking about captioning settings. Obviously, as I mentioned earlier, it's incredibly important when you're holding a virtual event to make sure that you have captioning accessible and providing that. That provides full accessibility. Also, for Zoom, there are 3 different options that you can use here, and I'm going to walk you through each one of them. On this slide here now, you can see a picture. It's a black box with white text. And this is an image from Zoom. It's a screen capture from Zoom, where the host or co-host can see that while they're trying to set up captioning services. So Zoom offers 3 different options here. The first one says you can assign to the meeting participant to be able to assign a participant to be able to type. That person must already be physically within virtually within the meeting itself. You cannot assign that role before they join the meeting. The second option is to have something integrated where you would have captioning services like an API token. We call it cart services. And what that means is that you're able to bring in a third party who's able to join your session and then link to the audio, and based on what they're able to hear from the audio, they're able to provide captioning in real time at the same time using their own software, and then it integrates within the Zoom platform. That is typically our best practice and what we've been using when we've been hosting public meetings. The reason why we've been doing that, it's a little bit better because you have an actual live person who is listening intently and making sure they're providing cart services in that way. And it's completely different than the third option. That third option is audio recognition, enable auto transcription. This is a new feature, which means that there's not going to be a live person involved. It's auto speech recognition. It's just computer software that's attempting to translate spoken word into the written word instead as best as it can. But however, it's typically not 100% accurate or effective because there's no live person monitoring the process for potential errors. So when you choose to use the third-party services, in that screen, in that box, you can see the text where it says, use third-party CC services or CC service. That integrates their software within the Zoom platform. Now, I do want to have an important note here about captioning and about recording. When you decide to go ahead and record a session, it is very important to be aware of the fact that captioning may or may not show up on the recording itself. So when you get the recording, it's important that you also get something that we call captioning file or a caption file. It's almost like a transcript. That means that you might have to go back, notice some of those typical everyday errors that are bound to happen in any kind of live service, and correct them from there in order to make that accessible. Next slide, please. When you're considering a virtual platform and the accessibility of that platform, we do have some best practices or some guidelines to help your audience feel thoroughly immersed within what's happening in the event. Although some platforms allow you to use a virtual background, I know that that can be great. I know so many of us are working remote these days, so you may not feel comfortable showing your background at home, but at the same time, it's important to be aware that doing that virtual background is more like a green screen. That potentially creates a barrier, a visual barrier, especially for people who are using sign language or people who have visual issues. They may have a hard time viewing the screen. So we recommend avoiding using virtual backgrounds. It's also important when you're presenting that you use video. When you're using video, to think about the lighting within the room, to make sure that you have enough lighting on your face so that you are bright enough. You don't want to have the light coming from behind you to have the opposite effect. You also want to make sure you have smooth and clear video where you can see facial expressions, body language, lip reading potentially for those who use that. You want to make sure that you're not losing that potential source for connection. There also are considerations for background noise. If you're speaking, we present go ahead and if you're not speaking, muting, because you don't know. We can't always avoid noise from pets or outside noises, construction, anything like that. I want you to be mindful of being aware of background noises and how best to prevent those being on the recording or in the event. One additional thing I want to mention here as well is that you have to allow people the option to, or you have to consider whether you want to allow people to have the option to mute and unmute themselves. It could be that you want to ask them to unmute themselves, but at the same time, if one person is in charge of muting and unmuting, then you can prevent things such as spoken audience overlap as well. If you have signing speakers and presenters involved, it's very important to make sure that you're not overlapping speakers and you assign a person who identifies who is going to be speaking as well. That's one thing that's incredibly helpful to make sure that you have a smooth flow for your event. And also, if you're providing captioning services, it will help the captioner identify who it is that is actually speaking. It's also important to consider that if someone makes an accommodation request for an ASL interpreter for your event, even if they're a participant, if there's a person who's using ASL and they want to go ahead and present something during your event, it's important to provide the two-way communication for them between the ASL interpreter and the deaf person who is using, or at least any person that is using sign language that they want to use during their presentation in order to make them visually accessible to communicate through and with the interpreter. Next slide, please. Now, we also have to consider thinking about the layout for Zoom and how to make that accessible. One thing that we've talked about for Zoom is that Zoom allows you, as the host, or really anyone there, it could be up to 9 different people on the screen. You can set that up, and the host or co-host can determine the spotlight of up to 9 people, which is a really nice feature, especially if you want to have a highlight for a specific presenter. You can pin them, you can focus more on what they're doing as well. It's also important as the host to consider that you'll have to move the layout potentially as well. If you're set up within the gallery view to have multiple people that you can see, you have to allow all the people who have their videos on, they could be on the screen at the same time. And the host has to decide if they want to share that with everyone who is attending the event, or if they want to allow the attendees to choose their own view. And again, it depends on the content and the intent of your own particular virtual sessions. If you have interpreters during your event, it's very important to make sure that you've moved the ASL interpreters to the top of the screen. This means that it will be more visually pleasing and easily accessible, and if there are any captioning services provided at the bottom of the screen, you want to make sure that the ASL interpreters are not being covered by the captions or vice versa. If you decide to record your event, then the person who's doing the recording on the computer screen should make sure to use the gallery view, and they should not pin anyone at all. One last thing that I want to consider here is that Zoom has a variety of views that you can use and different layouts that has a huge difference between gallery and speaker view. The reason why I bring this up is that if you're using gallery view for full accessibility with the visual layout, it's going to be because there is a difference for the speaker view. When you're doing a speaker view, it depends on who is speaking. So who is visually shown is who's speaking. If we have an ASL interpreter here right now, we want to make sure the ASL interpreter is visible. So I recommend that you don't use speaker view. If you're using a sign language interpreter, it will show who's speaking instead of who is signing for them in that moment. Next slide, please.
Hello, this is Diana Paiz, that's P-A-I-Z, with the Michigan History Center in the Michigan Department of Natural Resources. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. I am Latina, and I am blind. Today I'm sharing with you a presenter's guide to equity and inclusion. And we have a golden rule. Here it is. Create and perform every presentation with the understanding that whether you are aware of it or not, your audience very likely will include people with disabilities. 1 in 4 people has a disability. So whether virtual or in person, we will be in your classroom. We will be at your business seminar, your public meeting, and your family gathering. Your role as a presenter is absolutely key in providing an equitable and inclusive experience to your audience, regardless of their disability status. Next slide, please. So get off to a good start. Identify yourself by name, organization, and identities. When I introduced myself, I provided my pronouns, my race, and my disability. You share what you feel you are comfortable with or what is relevant, but understand that when you provide your identities, your audience does not have to make assumptions about you based on what you look like, what you sound like, or what your name is. Then provide your audience rules and tips on participation. Things like how and when to turn off and on your camera or microphone, how to ask a question or answer a poll, When we do this, we are not making assumptions about our audience's knowledge, and we're giving a baseline of information and hopefully providing a comfort level. Do not ask your audience to self-identify. If you've ever been in an in-person meeting where there's somebody at the front of the room tapping on the microphone asking if they can be heard in the back, or someone is sharing their screen in a virtual meeting and asking if you can see that. That's what we're talking about here. You're asking people to potentially reveal a disability that they may not feel comfortable with. And if you do your testing before the meeting, you can be confident about your audio levels, your competency and fluency in how to share your screen, and actually you will sound like a more confident presenter. And if there is a problem of any kind, someone in attendance will tell you without you having to ask. Next slide, please. Be an ally. So say your name every time you begin speaking after a break. This is really helpful when there are multiple presenters and participants. You'll see this in action when Amy and Kelly tag team on the last portion of this presentation. But we can't assume that any speaker can be readily identified either by sight or by sound. And so each person speaking just gives their name when they start speaking. Next, speak at a moderate pace and use plain language. If you speak fast and use complex words and sentences, you will leave some of your audience members behind. People have different rates of processing, and they also have a range of language abilities. So keep this in mind. We have here a link for tips on using plain language. Be patient, particularly when you are inviting interaction with your audience, because again, not everyone can process quickly and not everyone can react quickly. So someone may need time in making a decision as to whether they want to ask a question. Someone else may have difficulty in using a keyboard or a keypad. And someone else who uses assistive technology, again, may just need more time to do the things that allow them to be able to interact in the meeting. Next slide, please. Be inclusive. Start off by being specific. Spell out names and words that might be difficult or unusual, like I spelled my last name when I introduced myself. If you use acronyms, define them. By being specific, we're being inclusive of a range of language abilities, and we're also assisting interpreters and captioners, which in turn impacts the inclusion of the people who are using their services. Be descriptive. Whether you are using a PowerPoint or doing a show and tell, or just standing in front of a mic and camera, consider ahead of time how you are going to incorporate description into your presentation. Because to be inclusive, you will want to describe images, objects, gestures, and non-language sounds. You have a role as an interpreter. So for example, if you have chat open in a meeting, people who have telephoned into that meeting don't have access to that. So you might want to share that verbally. Similarly, if you've taken a poll, asked for a show of hands, the results of that is visual, and you will want to interpret that verbally for your audience. You'll also want to do the same with auditory information. So, for example, you can share things in the chat, such as spoken questions that have been asked, or off-camera audience reaction, such as applause or laughter. That dog that's barking in the background during your presentation. Let folks know in your audience so that everybody has the same access to that information. Next slide, please. Be respectful. This is about language that we use when we talk about disability. And so we have here person first versus identity first language. Person first puts the person before the disability. The example here is person with a disability. Then there's identity first language, which puts the disability before the person. And the example here is a disabled person. And there is debate about this, but generally speaking, person first language is considered most respectful. So we would want to say a person with a disability, or a man who is blind, a woman who is deaf. What do we call people without disabilities? Well, the answer is actually in the question. We call them people without disabilities. The term used to be able-bodied, but that is no longer really well looked upon because it does not acknowledge the disabilities such as bipolarism or depression, autism, epilepsy. So people without disabilities are people without disabilities. Avoid using terms like handicap and ADA as descriptors. Perhaps you've referred to those parking spots that everyone wants as handicap parking. Or you've heard somebody get directed to an ADA ramp. Well, handicap is an outdated term, so let's steer away from that. And ADA is a law. Let's call these things what they are, which is accessible. So there is accessible parking, an accessible bathroom, and an accessible ramp. Last, avoid words of judgment like impaired or confined to. Someone is not confined to a wheelchair. That person is a wheelchair user. Someone is not hearing impaired. In fact, that term is considered offensive. That person is hard of hearing. Next slide, please. So you know there is no one like you. You heard it here first. But you know, sometimes as presenters, we forget this and we make assumptions about the people in our audience. So please avoid using the word everyone. So many times in presentations, you will hear everyone knows this or everyone does that. The only thing that can really be said about everyone is that everyone has different life experiences, different backgrounds, and different abilities. When you're offering that great description that we talked about earlier, avoid saying for those, or as you can see, or as you can hear. That's not necessary. People who can see or can hear know that they can. And it makes you sound rather a little uncomfortable in offering your description. Also avoid saying for those who can't see or for those who can't hear when you offer your description, because that makes a group other. Similarly, when offering a description, do not call out a particular person. For example, if you are describing a picture and you know that an audience member named John is blind, do not direct your description to John, because that makes John other. Just offer all your wonderful description to all your audience, and they will appreciate it. Last, but certainly not least, please advise in advance of any changes in light, sound, flashing images, or potentially disturbing content. Remember, our audience members are all individuals. We don't know their disability or their trauma, and so we want to advise our audience of any potential triggers that might cause them harm. So that is a quick summation of equitable and inclusive presentations. I hope you'll incorporate them in your next and future presentations. Thank you so much.
This is Amy speaking. So as far as presentations, you want to remove barriers and make your slides and materials accessible as possible, and keep universal design in mind. Universal design allows accessible presentations to be available to all potential users, regardless of their abilities.
This is Kelly Frank, and Amy and I are going to be taking you through the basics of presentation materials and how to make those accessible for virtual presentations. Specifically, we're going to be talking about PowerPoint as an example, because PowerPoint, like many content products or applications that are available today, has a built-in accessibility checker. So something you should be aware of for any virtual presentation or even any in-person presentation that you may do, materials, content, and other activities should be reviewed for accessibility prior to the event. We do encourage you to utilize any built-in accessibility checkers or built-in accessibility features of whatever platform you're using. Again, today we'll be talking about Microsoft PowerPoint, because that's what we're using for today's session for our slides. It's what we are familiar with in terms of the presentations that we give at the state. And we'll also be sort of referencing some standards that relate to the State of Michigan Digital Standard, which is based on the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. That's WCAG 2.0 AA. And I just mentioned that to be specific, so you understand why we're referencing things like alt text, why we're referencing color contrast, where we're getting these standards or these guidelines from. And we get them from the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. So let's start with alt text. What is alt text? Alt text is alternative text. It helps people who can't see the screen understand images and other visual content. So in a PowerPoint, this would be smart art, graphics, shapes, charts, anything visual that you're going to be using, you can apply alternative text to, and you should apply alternative text to those images. So for example, here I have an image of the alt text button in Microsoft, and in the alt text descriptor, I have a screenshot that shows the description stating that this is the Microsoft alt text icon. So that's what you would use. If any photo that you use, you want to provide a description to it. So how do you use alt text? Alt text is something I tend to refer to as being more of an art than a science, because you really need to start with your reason for using the image. Is it an example of something you're talking about? Is this image providing emphasis? Is it for humor? That's really going to help you know what to describe about that image or how to describe that image. In general, though, there are some guidelines. You do want to keep your alt text between 1 to 2 sentences. You don't want someone's screen reader reading through an alt text image for, 5 minutes. It should be fairly brief. And then if you do need more robust description, it might be a best practice just to include that in your presentation. As the presenter, you can describe that image. You should also avoid phrases such as photo of or image of. If someone is using a screen reader, it will let them know that what they're viewing is a photo or an image. However, you may sometimes want to break this rule if the context is important. So again, if you're using a cartoon for humor, you just might want to mention, hey, this is a cartoon, and then you can describe that cartoon. Using the word cartoon automatically gives it some context. The person has a little bit more information about what that visual content might look like, and the style that it might be drawn in if it's a drawn cartoon. Beware of auto-generated alt text. I know Annie mentioned earlier, she talked a little bit about auto captioning and how that can not always be the most accurate. The same is true for things like auto-generated alternative text. It's a feature that can be found in some different types of content creation tools. However, the same with auto captions, it's typically not accurate. In fact, it's highly inaccurate in my experience. So just beware of auto-generated alt text. The safest thing you can do when you're designing content is just to turn it off. The other thing I want to talk about in terms of alternative text is decorative visual content. So the alt text panel in a Microsoft PowerPoint does have an option to mark content as decorative. This function, however, should only be used sparingly. You should only be using it when content is repetitive or when it's only added to provide visual interest. So for example, there's a border on these slides. It happens on every single slide. It's very repetitive, so we would mark that as decorative. The same can be said for a repeating logo. Now, you would want to describe that there is a logo maybe on the first slide or the first time it appears, but you do not have to provide that description on every following slide. Then it would just become repetitive. I will point out, though, that I have a photo here of a pink chrysanthemum in a field. And it is specific to this slide, although it is seemingly only provided for visual interest. Because it's specific to this slide, because it takes up so much of this slide, I would provide a description for this. Reason being is that people with screen readers should have the right to understand everything that's being communicated to anyone else who's watching the presentation. Therefore, if you're going to have something like this that's specific to a slide that takes up a majority of the slide that people may comment on, because it does take up a majority of the slide, it would be a good idea to add a description for that image. Now, I do give a rule of thumb that if an image is not adding information to a slide, good rule of thumb is maybe just don't use it, or rethink why you're using it. Why is this image important? Again, that's going to help you determine how to describe it, and it will also help you determine whether or not you actually need that image.
This is Amy speaking. So color can be a powerful tool for conveying information, but not everyone perceives it the same way. People who are blind, have low vision, or are colorblind can miss out on meaning conveyed by color alone. Color contrast examples, you can have green or green bolded, dark green, or even highlight the dark green text. As far as color coding, should either be avoided, especially the color red, or include a visual cue. This also helps when materials are printed in a grayscale. Next slide, please. As far as highlighting or drawing focus to words or a sentence, in order to highlight a portion of text and draw focus, you can bold it, you can italicize it, underline, or change the color. Using more than one of these techniques on the same text makes it a little bit harder to read. So the exception to the rule is to always use a second highlighting method along with a change in color for persons who are colorblind. And again, there should always be high contrast between the background and the print, and black and white is usually the best to use. Next slide, please. As far as readability, as you know, we may have many styles of fonts and sizes that are available, and some are easier to read than others. I suggest steering away from the fancy fonts such as the serif or the novelty fonts, and use sans serif, such as Arial, Century Gothic, and Tahoma, are to name a few. The sans serif fonts have no projecting lines at the ends, and they're just more clear, more crisp, and easier to read on the screen. Next slide, please.
This is Kelly. The other thing you should be aware of is how you present your hyperlinks. Hyperlinks should be descriptive. Reason being is that screen reader users will be able to use a list of links to navigate through your content. Therefore, it's important to have descriptive links that don't require context from the presentation. So we always say that they should be concise and meaningful. I've given a couple examples here. Federal ADA homepage. That's a concise and meaningful hyperlink. It tells you exactly where it's going to take you, and you don't even have to have seen the presentation to know where it's going to take you. State of Michigan ADA coordinator list, again, very descriptive, tells you exactly where that link is going to take you. But however, there are some examples of maybe not so great and not so descriptive hyperlinks. When you just put in a raw link where it has the https:// and then a bunch of gibberish following it, that is not a very meaningful hyperlink. That's not going to tell you where that link is taking you. Alternatively, we see a lot of times people having links that say click here. Again, that really doesn't tell me where that link is going to take me, why I'm clicking on it, and I would need more context perhaps to understand what that link is going to do. The other thing you should be aware of is slide titles. You want to make sure that your slide titles are unique. Again, a screen reader user will have the ability to navigate sort of a table of contents for their slide titles. Therefore, if some titles are repetitive, that can make it very difficult to determine which slide you're on. If I am watching a presentation and I'm a person who uses a screen reader and I have to step away for a moment, say to take a phone call or to deal with some sort of business, and then I try to come back to your presentation and find where you left off, if all of the slide titles are the same, for example, if all of these slides were titled accessible presentation, it's very difficult for me to find where you are or where I left off even. So that's why having unique slide titles is very important. And finally, I do want to discuss table structure. When it comes to tables, just keep it as simple as you can. Screen readers keep track of their location in tables by counting the cells. So if a table has nested cells or if they're merged or split, the reader can actually lose count and it won't provide any information beyond that point where it lost its way. So screen readers also use headers to navigate and will read tables from left to right and top to bottom. And I've provided an example here of how a screen reader would read through this table. It would read on the left-hand side here, then go to the right-hand side, and then so on and so forth down the two columns. Next slide, please.
Thanks, Kelly. This is Amy speaking. So as far as graphs, you don't want to have too much information that can create information overload. You want to identify what you want on the graph and to illustrate and highlight that information. Full data can be put on a hidden slide in case there is a question for more background data. You could also use a pattern fill or certain colors in graphs to show different values. A picture on the right is kind of a funny picture of a gentleman where he has several documents and forms coming out of his computer. So that's just an example of some information overload that someone experiences at work some days. Next slide, please. As far as video accessibility, there's some accommodation best practices. You want to have a transcript if you're able to. Transcripts are separate textual copy of the dialogue, and they're typically time-stamped. Also, you want to use the closed captions. Closed captions is rolling dialogue text along the bottom of the screen, which can be turned on and off. This often describes audio cues such as music or sound effects as well. As far as reading order, you want to check your reading order on your slides. Screen readers will read slide elements like text, photos, in the order that they were added to the presentation. This is often different from the order in which elements appear on the slide. And lastly, do this step last and avoid making other content changes as this may affect your reading order. Next slide, please. So we have some contact information and more resource information for you. The Michigan Department of Labor and Economic Opportunity. The two are Michigan Rehabilitation Services and Bureau of Services for Blind Persons. The contact information for MRS, Michigan Rehabilitation Services, is the following. Email mrs-customerassistance@michigan.gov. Customer assistance phone number is 517-241-5324. Toll-free number is 1-800-605-6722. And the website is www.michigan.gov/MRS. For Bureau of Services for Blind Persons, their phone number is 1-800-292-4200 or 517-241-1100. The TTY is 888-864-1212 or 517-241-1092. Fax 517-335-5140, and their website is www.michigan.gov/BSBP. Next slide, please. For Michigan Department of Civil Rights, the State ADA Compliance Division, Michigan Department of Civil Rights email is ADA compliance issues at michigan.gov. Their website is www.michigan.gov/ADA. And Division on Deaf, Deafblind, and Hard of Hearing. Email is doddbhh@michigan.gov. And the voice or video phone is 313-437-7035. Website www.michigan.gov/DODDBHH. Next slide, please. And the other contact is for Department of Natural Resources, Michigan History Center. Contact is Diana. Email is mhcinfo@michigan.gov. Phone number is 517-420-3261. Next slide, please. So thank you so much for joining us. You can go to our website for past and upcoming events regarding the ADA 30 series, and that's at www.michigan.gov/ADA 30. And please share your story, #ADA 30 and #MIADA 30. Have a wonderful day.